All right, in this lesson, we'll dive into the step method, which is another method that we can call on a number. And very similarly to the times method or the up to and down to methods that we explored previously, this is an example of a method that takes what's called a block, all right? And a block just specifies how that method is going to execute. Again, this is some pretty advanced stuff as far as Ruby goes, but we're going to dive into it in much greater detail. So this is more of an introductory overview just to get you comfortable with the syntax and some of the things you're going to see in future lessons. So if not everything makes sense, that's totally fine. As long as the big picture makes sense, as long as you understand what we're trying to do, then the syntax will come a little bit later, and that'll make sense as we proceed throughout the course. So step is a method, as I mentioned, that's called on a number. So let's say I take an integer like 1, and then I'm going to call the step method on it. We call a method with that dot syntax followed by the method name, which is step. Then I'm going to open my parentheses here. This is optional whenever you're calling a method, but I like to do it whenever that method accepts what are called arguments, which are just inputs. And the step method takes two arguments. The first argument is the number that we want to go to. So if we're starting at 0 and we want to step to that number, or basically increment to that number, here we have to specify what that endpoint or that end number will be. So let's say I want to go from 1 to 100. So I'm going to do step 100. We're going to go from 1 to 100. And basically we're going to be stepping. So unlike up to, which basically moves in increments of 1, step allows us to specify the size of the increment between each successive number. So the second argument here, after a comma, is going to be each step. So for example, if I want to move in sequences of 5, I can put 5 here. So we're going to move from 1 to 100, but in sequences of 5 instead of 1. Afterwards, what we do is we put our block. As a reminder, we can do that in two different ways. We can do that with curly braces. I'm going to do that in this first example, so I'm going to open my curly braces. That's done for blocks that generally only take up one line of code. Here I'm going to put my vertical pipes, and in here I'm going to put what's called a block variable. This is just going to represent each of my iterations. In this case, what we're basically going to be iterating over is a bunch of numbers, so I'm going to put number. This can be whatever you want. It could be NUM, it can be N, it can be your name, whatever you'd like. And here afterwards we're going to put what we actually want to do with each of those numbers. So as we increment from 1 to 100 in steps of 5, what do we want to do with each of those numbers? For now I'm just going to output it so you can see how this works in practice. So when I execute this, I'm just going to output the number. You can see we're going to move from 1 to 100 in increments of 5. So from 1, then to 6, then to 11, then to 16, 21, and so on. Each time we're simply adding 5 all the way until we get to 96. Why do we stop at 96? Well, because 96 plus 5 is going to be 101, and that takes us past the end point of our range, which is 100, so that's the point where we basically end. If I were to change this to 0, we would start at 0 and then go 0, 5, 10, 15, and so on. So if I executed it this way, you can see at this point we're going to go up to and include 100, which is the last part of our step sequence. So this number right here, the first argument to the step method, is inclusive. We're going to go from this point, stepping to this point in the increment that's provided right here. So here you can see we've done it in increments of 5. All right. So once again, the block is basically just specifying what we're doing with every single number that we loop over. If we were to simply leave out this block, if we were to delete this whole part, it would still step from 0 to 100 in increments of 5. It just wouldn't do anything because it doesn't know what to do with every sequence of 5, basically. So that's why we need to provide blocks to certain methods to provide more of an explanation to Ruby of what we actually want to do with each element of that iteration. Let's take a look at one more example of the step method, this time with a do end keyword instead of the curly braces. So let's keep this. Let's do 0. Let's step now instead to something like 85. And I'm going to step now in increments of 7 just so you can see some variety here. And now at the end we have to provide a block if we actually wanted to do something. And so here I'm going to do and end, a couple lines below. And again, do end is the exact same as curly braces. Do end is just used for multi-line blocks. That's just the best practice. And here on this first line, I'm once again going to put my vertical pipes. And here I'm going to put whatever I want to represent each number that we're basically going to be moving over. Again, we can represent this in whatever variable name we want. The last time we did number. This time I'll just do a single letter N because it's shorter. But it's totally up to you. You can call this, bazooka if you want. It's totally up to you. Obviously, something that is descriptive of what it actually is the best strategy to go to ensure your code actually reads simply and is easily understood. So here, since do end is supposed to ideally have more than one line, I'm going to do a first puts that's going to be something like, all right, let's go up by 7 again. I'm going to put an exclamation point at the end to show my excitement. And then I'm going to actually use end, but rather than simply output it like in the previous example, I'm actually going to interpolate it within my string. So I'm going to say, I'm now on num. So I'm going to use that hashtag followed by the curly braces to indicate that I'm interpolating something. I'm going to interpolate a variable. Of course, I just made a mistake because num is not the name of my block variable. It's simply n. That's going to make sense. So on every iteration, whatever n represents is simply going to be interpolated or injected into this second put statement. And when I output this, you can see we're going to get, all right, let's go up by 7 again on every single iteration. And then it's going to show us the sequence. I'm now on 0, I'm now on 7, I'm now on 14, I'm now on 21. It's basically stepping by sequences of 7. And just to show you side by side, if I were to do something like 0 up to 85, again, this up to method doesn't take a second argument, which represents the increment. This basically means we're incrementing by 1. So if I were to do something simpler like 0 up to 10, and then I'll do something like n puts n. Let me just comment this code right here. I'm going to select it all and then do command / and that's going to comment it. So this is going to output everything from 0 to 10, all right? So in step terms, it's basically the same thing as doing 0, step 10, and putting an increment of 1. But generally, if you're going to be doing something like this, it's better to just stick with the up to method because it's more logical. The step method is used when you want to specify a custom level of increment, a custom number that you're increasing by each time. But otherwise, if I output this and I do the exact same thing, you can basically see that the result is the exact same. It's going to go from 0 to 10 and do something on every run of that execution, all right? So again, the step function or the step method basically just increments from a certain position to another position in whatever numeric increment you want. On each iteration, you can specify what you want it to do on each iteration. That's done through the provision of a block. Without a block, the method is basically pointless. It'll still run behind the scenes, but basically does nothing. It just goes from 0 to 85 without doing anything. But here with a block with either the curly braces or do end, we can specify what we actually want to do as we're proceeding through this entire execution. And that's the step method, again called on an integer object or a fixed num object in Ruby.